Thank you, Marius, and thanks everyone for joining and staying late. Fully conscious that there's only a few sessions left, so I'll try and keep it engaging and keep everyone smiling. I'm super happy to be here in Warsaw. So second time in Poland, first time in Warsaw, getting to meet a bunch of folks for the first time and meet even more new people. So thanks so much for being here, and a huge thanks for Marius for putting on this amazing event. So today I'm going to be talking about unlocking international strategies for mobile games, and apps is in there as well. So if the content doesn't cover too much on the app side and you're not a mobile game, just catch me after and we can go into a bit more detail. So who am I? My name is Owen. I work as a Principal Gaming Growth Manager on the EMEA App Dev team in Google, primarily working with game studios across CEE, across many different verticals, sizes, and folks. In terms of what I'm going to chat about today, I'm going to set the scene of what do we need to look at and consider before we look internationally, help you guys put some structure around identifying some opportunities, and then also kind of look into what it means on the ground, like what is the operational effectiveness required to put some of these strategies in place. So without further ado, why are we here? Businesses that are able to succeed in multiple markets, diversify their risk, and are better set up for long-term success. It's a fundamental point of growing a company and also keeping it sustainable over time to get new revenue streams from different sources. Apps is one of these amazing products that is very, very easy to export internationally. If you are working on the shopping side, a little bit more difficult. On the finance side, maybe some policy issues. Today we'll mention social casino and real money gambling also, but in general, you port it to a different country and off you go. Having said that, well, that sounds quite simple. There's a lot going on in the space, so I'm not going to go too much into the details of each individual moment here. We've seen that the market is normalizing, there is some pockets of growth, but it is still a complex structure and you need to understand and make the right decisions on where to go and effectively not waste investment. At the same time, there's plenty of change going on. So there's AI coming at you left, right, and center. You've probably heard it many, many times today. And you'll start to see it in your Google Ads interface as well too. So this particular GIF is an example of generative AI, which is now available in Performance Max and should be available in most ad group creation processes as well. I don't have it on the slide here, but a little sneak peek is that you'll have more conversational experiences coming into the Google Ads interface. So you'll be able to ask it, for example, show me your most profitable campaign. Can you tell me which countries are growing for my particular type of game or app? And there's a lot that you'll want to consider going down the line. So as a quick show of hands, in terms of folks that work in the Google Ads space, so on the UA side, do you have a setup that maybe looks like this? You've got one game and you've got a US campaign. So quick show of hands. Okay. Got a couple of folks. Maybe it looks a bit more like this and you're a little bit further down the line. So you've got US and you've got tier 1 grouped. Or perhaps you're even more advanced and you've got a full spread across the board, but maybe they're bunched up a little bit and you're not sure where to go next. So what we want to help you do is to basically adapt to this complexity. Adding to that, the gaming landscape at the moment is looking at 30 plus countries across 15 languages. So how do you decide where to go and what to do? So like any good business decision, you look at someone that's done it first and you learn from their mistakes and where their success has been. So what we did was we took a look at a few different categories. In this case, casual games. So if we look at the top investors in terms of the top games, we see that they focus more of their spend or percentage of spend on developing and emerging markets, whereas the average casual game tends to just focus on tier 1 and primarily the US. We're also seeing this across genres, so I could have picked many different genres here. We've looked at casual and also now strategy. And you'll see that, for example, we see Brazil in there. They tend to diversify the spend and not just neglect the emerging markets. So we'll talk about pricing and monetization later on and understand how they're able to do this and what separates them. For the social casino and RMG category, we're starting to see this across devices now as well. So in Poland, for example, recently we are now able to show ads for websites. So we see on the website of things that's kicking off. And we have companies that haven't done things like PMax or demand gen or YouTube campaigns before, fully immersing themselves in that environment. And then on the social casino side, we have companies that were pretty much web first, now moving into the app space. And then we have the same thing happening on the opposite side. To add a little bit more complexity into it for the social casino folks, if you're looking at expanding internationally, we require you to have two accounts, depending on where you're looking to go. So Group 1 is typically Tier 1, Group 2 is typically APAC. If you want to know the exact split, I can share the link after, but it's just an additional consideration that we have to keep on board. So in terms of, we've got the setting the scene out of the way, where can I actually look and find these opportunities? So what we want to do is help you put a bit of structure around that process. So first off is finding the most profitable markets. What is the revenue potential if you get it right? So things like market size and growth projections, consumer spending patterns, seasonality, is it the right time to go there? And from the RMG category, is there additional policy requirements? Or for example, if you work with a kids app, is there additional policy requirements that are needed on that front? Next up, we look at what are the barriers to entry. So what's going to stop us getting there? So we will look at things like competitive intensity. Do you select maybe the second most popular market instead of going into the highest potential one because of these barriers? What are the localization requirements? So things like English language proficiency, legal requirements on the RMG side, or again, the kids app side. And then also the timing. Is it the right time to enter this market, or should we hold off and wait for a new seasonal event to pop up? And then last but not least, we've heard in a couple of different presentations today about the importance of knowing your audience and understanding their personas. So I would encourage you to absolutely storyboard and have your audience personas if you don't already have them. And then take a picture of the storyboard and put a couple of different flags beside it and think about how this user might use your app differently in different contexts from a cultural point of view, and also whether they actually know about the type of game or app that it is in their destination. Underpinning these is your own capabilities and resources. Like, do you have in-house teams? Do you have localization capabilities? Is that an additional cost? Do you need to outsource? So fundamentally, it's easy to say that I'm going to go to these 14 different markets, and then someone from Google comes to you and says, okay, you need this much budget per day for each market, and it's not potentially realistic with this set of capabilities, but we can help you go market by market and understand where to start first and provide different resources along the way. And then finally, underpinning the whole thing is the commitment to a plan. So we've seen many different companies kind of come to us and ask for advice on international markets, but the ones that succeed the most are the ones that have a bit more of a longer term vision and say, okay, Germany is a core market for us and we want to make it work. We understand that it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy road, particularly in the early days, but we're committed to this and we recognize that we want to make it work. So when we look at some of the barriers to entry, language is one that kind of comes up first. As AI improves, we're going to have better language processing capabilities, and you're going to have potentially some of these get more competitive in one way, but also allow you to enter them in another way. So for example, here on the RPG front, maybe you don't go into Japan because you've gone there on a trip, you see that there's billboards everywhere for different RPGs, you know that it's really high CPI, you've seen that the ARPDAU is huge, but you're not sure that's the right step first. So what we would do is work with you, look at the different competitor sets that you have, understand how important the English proficiency is. So for example, if you've got a puzzle game, maybe you don't show that much dialogue, maybe there's not that much involved. We could look at that from a different perspective, but looking at it across different genres, maybe you go into the next best market, and maybe that's the cheaper option to test and understand what else you're missing from a business point of view to get you to the next level. As I mentioned before, we've got the audience personas, and they do react differently to different types of games and different types of cultures. I was speaking with a client of mine yesterday, basically explaining how in some APAC markets they have a Yahtzee game, but it doesn't resonate in a couple of those markets because the users are not used to that type of game. So maybe you need to educate them or simplify that game, or go with a different game that you have and enter that market first. So for example, using solitaire to get a good understanding of it. And you will also have to adapt to, I guess, the different cultural nuances that apply to different folks in these markets. Next, we want to look at your top line goals. So what are key important things that we look at before we even consider going into a market? First off is your core setup. Are you technically set up? Is the app available there? Have you got the app store set up? Have you got your localization capabilities at least getting ready in the background? From the RMG or any policy restricted environments, if you Google gambling and games policy, Google Ads, that will bring you to a page that is ultimately your cheat sheet for what's happening. At the top of that also you'll see what's called a change log. So for example, recently in social casino, we are no longer able to show ads in Italy. So that's going to impact worldwide campaigns, for example. So these are things that we need to consider and keep going. Next up is the market sizing. So do you truly understand the size of the market? There's plenty of external tools. We've seen many folks today give presentations on ample amounts of data, so you can also tap into them. But generally, the approach that we take is understanding your competitor list and looking at where they are, where you sit in terms of effectiveness against those, and where the pockets of opportunity lie. Generally, we look at this across different time periods, and the reason for that is 9 times out of 10, someone's not going to invest in one place for a very long time if it's not profitable. It just doesn't make business sense, so we can take a bit of confidence into going into a new market from that and understand what's required there. Next up, on the implementation and optimization side, so localization, we'll go into it a little bit more. Then have a look at your optimization cadence. So for example, if you are running a TROAS campaign for 7 days, you're going to want at least 3 or 4 windows to understand what's going on. So like a month worth of testing before you kind of either truly commit or look elsewhere in terms of that market. And then finally, on the creative roadmap side of things, I would take whatever you're doing in the US and then make a plan off of the back of that. So if we jump into the interface, you've already got your worldwide campaign or you've already got your tier 1 campaign. Where can you find a little bit more insight as to what's going on? So you'll notice on the left, we have the Insights and Reports tab. If you click through, we can check when and where your ad showed. And then you can look at, on the right-hand side here, matched locations. So what you want to look at here is bringing in the conversion value over cost column, which is your ROAS, and then have a look at your bid strategy report, which is where you can see what your current ROAS is over a time period. You'll also see what your impression to conversion lag is. And effectively what I do in this screen is take cohorted data, so say 7 days, 7 days, 7 days looking back, and look at the change in the ROAS for particular geos. You're going to have standout geos that you may consider splitting out into campaigns that are standalone. So if you have one that's like a superstar, well then let's split that out, give it its own bid, its own budget, and really push it. You'll also have maybe surprise geos in there that you haven't thought about previously, but maybe smaller scale, but maybe super profitable for you, and that could be your niche to launching in another few markets off of the back of that. And then last but not least, we often see, it's not in this example, but we often see Korea and Japan perform quite poorly in this particular setup, and that is because of the nuance required on the localization and language requirement side. Last but not least, you're going to want to look at what you exclude. So are you going to actually get rid of some geos from this campaign that are not performing well at all? Now, we'll move on to operational effectiveness. What does this look like in practice? On the localization point of view, a few key things to consider. Obviously, your copywriting and culturalization, internationalization, which is basically working within a specific framework, which I'll chat through, your translation and review process, and also testing. And then one kind of fundamental element that may be a little bit overlooked, and we'll have a look at why, is the pricing and monetization strategies. All of this is going to be underpinned by your business model, which you may need to kind of rethink, especially from an international lens, and then also your creative capabilities. So you may have an in-house creative team that are able to make creative pretty quickly that's US focused, but are they able to do the same thing for Japan in a different art style, or Korea in more of a pop art style? When we look into localization specifically, okay, what's included here? So there's 4 key elements. One is the copywriting and culturalization point of view. Main thing here is just be aware of any kind of cultural nuances, so kind of avoid taboo topics, keep it light, make sure you're getting it reviewed. The internationalization framework is more to do with the syntax, formats, fonts, dates, currencies, that side of things. Translation and review is super important. Translations are going to get easier and easier over time. The review part is where you're going to have to probably double down. So just make sure you have a good quality control process in place. And then last but not least, is the testing side. So we'll have a look at some elements as to where the testing is important beyond just translating specific text. From a copywriting point of view, some of it comes back to just general UX fundamentals. So on the left, for example, quite clear, effective. On the right, very wordy. If you think about translating this, it just makes more problems later on. Like I mentioned with the puzzle games, if you have tons and tons of text, it means more and more to translate, potentially more and more mistakes that could happen. But again, we can help you through that process. One other area is that obviously people are going to pick up the app, put it down, come back and go through different elements and different phases and levels. On the right-hand side is an example where the initial translation was really good and well put together. The character is quite grumpy, but like kind of a mentor figure in this example. However, later on in the story, they turn very formal. So maybe this was a change in the translation process or the review process. And as a player, you might feel like, why is this character now feel different or act differently within the story? So just make sure you're looking at it through all of the game itself. Smaller things from an artistic style. So on the left-hand side, this developer basically put in place a bit more nuance on the right to make sure it was looking like a coin rather than what could have been perceived as a change up of the Japanese flag. And then on the right-hand side, we have like the celebration of cultural events. This is an example from Overwatch, looking at the cherry blossoms and also the art style in the buildings, which just provides that ambience and the cultural elements that make you feel immersed in a title. Next up, we look at the culturalization piece. I've kind of put a pricing lens on this because it's really important to understand the difference between a high context culture and a low context culture. Low context culture in this case, if we think like American or English, where we have maybe less on the screen and less symbols and objects that are tied to different meanings, whereas, for example, in high context cultures, like China, we have things like the color red, certain symbols, certain animals, certain characters, which all have really significant cultural context that you don't want to mix up or tie in. So, for example, if you have characters in your game or farm elements or the color red is not prevalent, they might be things that you look at. A really nice way to enter some of these markets, as we mentioned earlier, is the seasonal point of view. Lunar New Year is a really good opportunity to kick things off there. You have games that you would never expect to jump on kind of Lunar New Year or kind of cultural moments like Ramadan. They really resonate within those markets, and it's a good opportunity to test your creative out within those. Next up, from the text expansion side of things, is more related on the testing. So while the translation is correct here, on the left-hand side, it might be even harder to read than it is on the slide. Just make sure that you've got your line spacing correct and that it makes sense from a UX perspective that this person can actually fundamentally walk through the game without having to kind of zoom in or screen in. On the translations and review topics, 3 key elements. We've got tools, supply chain, and your KPI system. Tools, there's lots of them available, and they're going to be a bit more prevalent, I think, over the next while. So if we look at creating like continuous localization workflows. On the supply chain, it's just making sure that you have a really kind of tight closed loop, making sure that quality is there throughout. So in the previous example, if you do change supplier or change the person doing the translations, even if it's across geos, have some sort of structure in place that system stays the same so you can continue the quality across the board. And then last but not least is to have a KPI system around it. So don't just say, okay, translation's done, off we go. Make sure that you're following a single process across different markets. Finally, one last thing on the testing side is just make sure that we've no kind of awkward line breaks, no untranslated content in there, and if there's any translation mistakes as you go through the full game, just keep an eye on that. So I mentioned earlier that pricing and monetization is super important. So important, in fact, that it has even more emphasis than the acquisition side or on the retention side. So very, very important that you have at least a conversation about this when you leave here today. Typically in the past, your pricing and monetization was kind of decided on the type of game that you had. So we have hyper casual, we show ads, we have RPGs, we have in-app purchases. So while we're probably all sick to death of hearing that hyper casual is dead or hybrid is on its way, we've seen it on both sides of this chart. So while hyper casual games are moving more into casual and a little bit more IP focused, we're seeing it on the other way as well. So strategy games that maybe in the past wouldn't have looked at markets like Brazil or India are adapting their strategies to also show more ads there and monetize in those markets in a different way. And from a Google perspective, we're making a lot of this possible in terms of the evolution of the TROAS campaign structure. So there's now 4 different ways of doing TROAS. We've got straight up purchase, we've got ad revenue, we've got hybrid, which is the mix of both, and then you can also do a custom event, which is similar to the purchase algorithm. So what do we do as a next step? One is just understand price discrimination and why it might be important for you going forward. Typically used a lot in like retail, and it's very, very prevalent already. So for example, like YouTube Premium does not cost the same in the US as it does in Germany, as it does in Ireland. There are some kind of pushbacks and some, I guess, expectations to consider here. Some questions that we get are, well, what if users see that it's cheaper in another market and they kind of don't really like the fact that we've done that? Or, for example, why can't folks just use a VPN to get around it and work on it that way? What we find is that when you actually put time and effort into this, you'll see that they tend to be kind of smaller problems within the bigger pie that you can go after, especially on the VPN side. One area that folks use to kind of get around this in certain situations is for one market, in an IAP context, you might purchase coins. In another market, you might purchase gems or rubies or something else. So there is different values involved for different things if users are looking across the board. Fundamentally, why it works is that there is a higher willingness to pay in certain geos. A lot of these will not be a surprise, but this is just an example of kind of pairings that you could make, for example, Tier 1 US and Canada, Tier 2 Western Europe, Tier 3 India and Brazil. We've seen actual success with this strategy when talking with UA teams. So while across the business you might have had these conversations, these are actual results from several different clients that have put this strategy in place across the board. So as you can see, they're not small numbers, they're impressive metrics, but again, you're gonna have your own version of this over time. So there will be testing and iteration over time, but please do come up and ask questions after if you have some more. So what does an actual real life journey, I'm not sure if anyone in the room is here, but this might look familiar to at least one person. This was a client of mine where we went from 2 geos and now they are across 24, I think, as of last week. So the first thing was I came to them and said, why are we only doing US and Canada? Canada was a really small amount of the revenue. And they basically just said, it's working well. I'm happy with it. Everything else seems like a lot of effort. Why should we do it? So basically showed them some insights, got their competitors, said, look, there's a really big opportunity for you here, but I understand where you're coming from in terms of this is gonna take some effort. So why don't we start with the low-hanging fruit? So the low-hanging fruit in this case was other English-speaking geos. So we had Australia, New Zealand, and UK, and we grouped them into one campaign so that we had enough volume. And that made sense for them. That was their kind of aha moment to say, okay, we don't have to look at all 30 plus geos. We don't have to have translations across the board. Let's take it step by step. They seen the results, it was working well. While these campaigns started to scale up, they started looking at localization, particularly for, we started off with the DACH markets. So we had a DACH campaign, German language and English language ad groups. Then, as that progressed, we moved into France, Portugal, and also Poland. So they then got the bug, and we're like, okay, what's next? We can see this gradually ramping up. Where can we go next? They started to grow their team off of the back of it. And now, about a couple of months ago, we started looking at APAC, but obviously it takes a little bit longer to work with those markets. So we split those out from the top performers, and now they're running fine and still going strong. Underpinning this was the product evolution, as I said. So we started off with one version of TROAS. We're now using those other ones across different geos. The localization and app readiness was something that was looked at after the English-speaking markets. And then last but not least, we're looking at iOS now and how to develop beyond the US and Japan, which are the two highest iPhone penetration markets. So 30 seconds over. In summary, basically we want to help you adapt to that complexity. We understand it's a changing environment. Be sure you're structuring your opportunity identification, and it's not just like a spray and pray or this market looks good, let's go there. And then last but not least, be deliberate in your localization efforts. Thanks so much, and let me know if you have any questions.